What's up, eco nerdlings? In this podcast, we're going to be talking about the environmental impact of the human population. So basically, what are we doing to the earth? So first of all, I want to start off with the environmental impact equation. This was developed by Paul Ehrlich, and it's called the Paul Ehrlich formula. So he basically took the population times the affluence times the amount of technology, and that gives us the environmental impact of that person. So developed countries, and remember developed are countries like the United States that have good medication, good health care, clean water, enough food for most of the citizens, versus developing countries which lack good medical care, they lack clean water, they lack food and that type of thing. So in developed countries, we have high rates of resource use, which results in very high levels of pollution as well as environmental degradation per person. So each person is going to contribute drastically to the environmental degradation of the earth. These are believed to be the key factors determining overall environmental impact. So looking at these pictures right here, what was done is that a photographer decided to photograph what an average family eats in many different countries around the world. So these are just three of the ones that I chose from that study. So I chose Chad, Ecuador, and the United States. So looking at the picture, you can see that a family in the United States consumes much, much more than families in other areas around the world, such as Chad, which looks like they consume the least out of the three families that I chose. This family of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lived mostly off of grains, probably rice, that type of thing. A few might look like legumes, some type of bean maybe that they were eating. And then in Chad, they ate a lot more fruits and vegetables. Looks like they have some type of roots, leafy greens. I believe that's a sack of potatoes. And again, they had grains. But the United States by far consumes more. So looking at that data, you can see that it's estimated that the average US citizen consumes 35 times as much as the average citizen in India, and 100 times as much as the average person in the world's most poor countries. So thus, the poor parents in a developing country would actually need to give birth to 70 to 200 kids in order for them to have the same lifetime environmental impact as only 2 kids in the United States. So urbanization. What exactly happens in urbanization? Well, unfortunately, we tend to see slums developing. This can lead to fecal snow as well as disease. And some of you may be thinking, what the heck is fecal snow? That sounds nasty. It's exactly what it sounds like. It is feces, because in urbanization or urbanized areas, a lot of times there's not proper sanitation. So people will go to the bathroom in ditches or even in the middle of the street. So all of that fecal material adds up, and sometimes, the wind kicks up, it might be dried out, and it literally makes clouds that dust or snow fecal. So obviously that's going to lead to diseases because there is literally feces raining down in the air. This problem doesn't exist too much in the United States because we have much better working and housing conditions, as well as air and water quality that are much more improved than they are in developing countries. So even in the poor areas of the United States, we tend to have much greater sanitation levels than you'll see in a developing country. Urban areas must import most of their food, water, energy, minerals, as well as other resources. And they produce enormous quantities of wastes that can pollute the air, water, and land. So if you've ever gone to a large city, such as the one that we're close by, which is Houston, you might have gone to LA, New York. A lot of times in those big cities, at either dawn or dusk, meaning right before the sun rises or sets, you're going to see this haze. And that's all of the pollution, or what we call smog, that has gotten into the air. So all of those pollutants that get trapped. A lot of times you'll see a lot of contaminants in the waters. You'll see different types of contaminants in the land as well, lots of chemicals and that type of thing. 44% of the world's people live in urban areas. These occupy only 5% of the world's land. So 44% of the world's population living on only 5% of the entire land on Earth. And those 44% of the people that live on only that 5% of Earth consume 75% of the world's resources. So reasons for world hunger issues. So why is there a hunger issue? I know a lot of people think we have all of this food, but unfortunately, in developing countries, people don't have access to food like we do here in the United States. So there's a very unequal distribution of available food throughout the world to all of the human populations. There's a loss of arable land, meaning land that can be used to grow crops. We also have an increasing population growth rate, so more people is going to be harder to feed than a lower population. So a lot of times, I know on TV you might be flicking through the channels and you'll see one of those commercials about starving people in Ethiopia and different countries, and you'll see pictures like this where, you know, they'll show children or adults that are completely emaciated. They have, you know, bloated stomachs, you can see their ribs, they'll have, you know, fuzz growing on them, all signs of severe starvation. And that's because they don't have enough available food to get to them. And this is increasing poverty in developing countries as well, also leads to hunger issues. So the reasons the human population has been so dramatic in the last century, well, the reason it's been so dramatic is, number one, we had the Industrial Revolution, which led to the invention of many amazing things, but large contributor is going to be modern medicine. Now that we have modern medicine, we can perform surgeries that people would have otherwise died if they hadn't gotten. So for example, if your appendix ruptured or something like that way back in the day, you know, you had two options. Either one, you're probably going to die of a bacterial infection if you just leave it alone. Number two, you're going to have to go get surgery, but guess what? There's no anesthesia. So you're literally strapped down to a table, fully awake, while someone cuts into you. And even if you have that surgery, they didn't have aseptic techniques that would prevent the spread of bacteria or at least reduce the spread of harmful bacteria. So you still had a very high chance of dying due to a bacterial infection because, again, we didn't have antibiotics. So modern medicine brought antibiotics. So when we have a sickness due to bacteria, we can take antibiotics and most of the time we'll get better. If something's wrong with us, we can get surgery, we can go to a doctor. There's typically different types of treatments. If we get cancer, we can get chemotherapy, we can have radiation treatments. None of those existed back then. So because of all of these recent advances in medicine, the human population grew because not as many people were dying. So strategies for ensuring adequate nutrition for a growing population on Earth. So basically, what can we do to ensure that everybody is getting food? Well, several things have to be done. Number one, we need to increase the number of new food crops from a diversity of plants. So meaning we need to bring in new competitors, new crops, more diversity, meaning we want a difference in crops. So, you know, not just our rice and our corn, we want a variety of crops. We also need to distribute food more equitably, meaning all of food shouldn't be kept in one country. We need a more equitable distribution of food around the world, and we need to help people learn how to grow their food. We also need to increase the amount of land that's dedicated to grain production rather than meat production. So if you think way back to your freshman year of biology, we went over food pyramids. I'm not talking about, you know, like apples and your fats and all that. I'm talking about the food pyramids that go with trophic levels, where we have our producers at the bottom, then we have our primary consumers, our secondary consumers, so on and so forth. So if you boggle your mind back to then, and you think that looking at those trophic levels, if you remember, only 10% of the energy at each level gets passed on to the level above it. So only 10% of the nutrition in plants, or excuse me, the energy in plants, gets passed on to the primary consumers. So by growing plants and making our diets more plant-based, we can sustain more people. So another way to look at it is if we have 8 acres, now we could grow crops on that 8 acres. You know, we could grow rice, we could grow beans, anything, any type of plant-based diet. So we could grow a lot more food on 8 acres if we are growing plants than if we are raising some type of livestock such as cattle. So we would produce much more food if we use that 8 acres to produce plants that humans could eat, rather than to produce plants that would then be eaten by cows that would then be eaten by us. So we would be getting, instead of 10% of the energy, we would be getting 1% from the amount of energy that started with the plants. And we're going to have a lot less food to begin with as well, because that 8 acres is going to support a lot less cows than it's going to support plant life. And then we also need to assist developing countries in efficient crop irrigation systems. So as far as that goes, that means watering the plants. So we're going to need to help those countries figure out how to irrigate their crops so they don't die or desiccate, meaning dry out. So fertility rates and reduction. One of the huge environmental pressures of urbanization from population growth is a reduced birth rate in urban areas. So the birth rate in urban areas is typically 3 to 4 times lower than the birth rate in rural areas. The reason for that is in the rural areas, that's where we're going to have farming taking place, ranching, we're growing crops. So the more children that people in rural areas have, those are the more hands they have helping them with chores, helping them to plow the fields, helping them to feed and water livestock and that type of thing. And cities actually provide education opportunities. So living in an urban area, you're going to have more education opportunities. You're not going to be as concerned with having children to help out around the farm. You're going to be concerned more about, how am I going to educate my child? How much is this child going to cost? Rather than in a rural area where you're looking more at, how am I going to, get all of the chores done on my 20 acres of land? So some countries, including China, actually penalize couples who are having more than 1 or 2 children. So this is another way that population is being put in check as far as the human population, or how we're trying to control it. So China, we talked about in a previous video lecture, has a huge plan or family plan that they've implemented, which has drastically reduced their population. So what they do is they basically tell couples, you can only have 1 child. 2 if the first child you had is a girl, and I believe 2 if there are no other siblings in the family. So if you don't have any aunts or uncles, if you were an only child, I believe you could have 2 children. So they're penalized if they have more than 2 children by raising their taxes. Sometimes the government will charge them other fees. They might eliminate income tax deductions for that couple's 3rd child. And a lot of times that entire family will lose their health care benefits, they'll lose their food allotments, and they'll also lose job options. In China, couples who pledge to have no more than 1 child receive a lot of perks. They get extra food, they have larger pensions, they get better housing, they get free medical care, they get salary bonuses, they also get free school tuition for their 1 child. Preferential treatment is given in employment when their child enters the job market as well. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bias that goes around with that, and there's a very big push to have a male. So a lot of times girls are aborted at a higher rate than boys, and some infant girls are actually killed. So they'll carry them full term and actually kill that baby once they give birth to it because they want a boy. Male children are often given preference. They're fed better than some of the female children as well. So solutions to influencing population size. Obviously, family planning is a huge factor in reducing the number of births and abortions throughout most of the world. Women tend to have fewer children if they meet some of these conditions. So women who are very educated tend to have less children. Women that hold a paying job outside of the home also tend to have less children. Women that do not have their human rights suppressed tend to have fewer children as well, because they don't have that pressure of being married to a man, and whatever that man wants or whatever that man says is what goes. She doesn't have an opinion. But whenever it's reversed, or I don't want to say reversed, but whenever women have rights and they're allowed to say, no, I don't want to have 10 children, they tend to have fewer. The best way to slow population growth is a combination of several different things. 1, investing in family planning. 2, reducing poverty. 3, elevating the status of women, meaning that women are no longer subservient to men, they are equals. So factors that affect birth rate and fertility rates. Obviously, the importance of kids in the labor force. So you'll see a lot in developing countries. They're going to have higher kids, more kids being born to go into the labor force to work in the crops. Urbanization plays a role in it. The cost of raising and educating children. The availability of private and public pensions, religious beliefs, traditions, and cultural norms. So there's always that fine line of, is it okay for the government to say you should only have one child or, two children? Obviously, religious beliefs also play a very important role because there are some religions that say absolutely no birth control. Whatever, however many kids that you have is the number that you were meant to have. So there are some religions which absolutely say zero birth control. So obviously that kind of contributes to population in the world as well. Education and employment opportunities, infant mortality rates. So we're going to have much higher infant mortality rates in the developing countries versus the developed countries such as the United States. The average age of marriage. So in a lot of the developing countries, people get married at a much, much earlier age. So, for example, my grandparents were from Lebanon. My grandpa was 28 years old. However, my grandma was only 14 years old when they got married, and she started having kids at the ripe old age of 15, and she had 8 children. The availability of reliable birth control. So, is there birth control out there that you have access to? And in a lot of countries, especially obviously those third world or developing countries, they don't have much access to birth control. So looking at this pie chart, this is the estimated use of contraceptive methods in the 1990s by married women ages 15 through 49 across the globe. So not in the United States. The United States would probably look much more different than this. This is globally, so worldwide. So looking at this, the first thing you should notice is that almost half of the world population uses no method of birth control at all. So obviously that's going to contribute drastically to the human population. 17% worldwide is going to be female sterilization, meaning that they are going to sterilize the female through a surgical procedure and prevent her from having children. IUD, that's a little kind of like a little T-shaped thing that gets inserted into the uterus that helps to prevent pregnancies. 10% would be other methods. So the most common of those would be the pull-out method, which is obviously not a very effective method of birth control. 8% are the pill, which includes obviously, like the Ring and things like that, the patch that some people wear. Male sterilization. This is where through a surgical procedure, males are sterilized and they're prevented from having kids, so meaning they no longer, whenever they ejaculate, they no longer have sperm in their semen. And then condoms are only used by 5% of the world population that are married. So in 1994, an international conference on population and development met because they were trying to figure out what can we do about this growing world population, how can we put it in check and prevent it from continuing to grow exponentially. So one of the things they wanted to do was encourage action, and again, they wanted to stabilize the world population at about 7.8 billion by the year of 2050. Now, that's a pretty tall order because the world population is already over 7 billion right now, and currently we're in the year 2014. So they want to do that instead of the projected 11 to 12.5 billion in 2050. So probably not going to happen. It's probably not going to happen to level off at 7.8 billion, but they're hopeful. And if you want to know more about this conference, so you want to read a little bit more than what I've just told you, I have a link right here that you're more than welcome to go to if that interests you. And then some of the major goals of the conference that was called, they wanted to provide a universal access to family planning services, so educating people about what it takes to have a family and things that go into, nurturing your children. They want to improve the health care of infants as well as children and pregnant women. They want to encourage the development of national population policies. And they also want to improve the status of women by expanding education as well as opportunities. Because as you remember from previous in this lecture, we talked about the more educated women are, the more equal they are to men in a society, they typically have less children. So obviously, again, increase to access of education for girls. They want to increase men's involvement in child rearing. So instead of it being typically the female role, they're suggesting that maybe a male role should also be added to that. So there should be an equal or a partnership whenever you're rearing children, instead of it being solely the female's job to rear those children. They also wanted to take steps to eradicate poverty, and they wanted to reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. So declining fertility rates, meaning fewer babies per woman. The replacement level to sustain a population is at 2 children. So remember, we talked about that earlier, where we have a man and we have a woman. If they have 2 children, when that man and that woman die, those 2 children will replace them in society. And the population is going to stay level. It's not going to increase, it's not going to decrease. Now, if we have anything over 2, so at 2.1, that population is going to be increasing. At 1.9, the human population would be decreasing. So currently, in 2006, whenever this data was collected, the average global total fertility rate was 2.7, so the human population was still growing. It's 1.6 in developed countries, so that's down from 2.5 in 1950. And then it's about 3 in developing countries, which is, down from 6.5 in 1950. So the rate at which we're having children, or the fertility rate, is decreasing, but we still have a fertility rate or a replacement level that's higher than being at equilibrium. So we are still continuing to grow the population, but we're not growing the population as rapidly as we were in the 1950s. So looking at everything that humans have kind of done to the world and all of the ecosystems, we've used technology to alter much of the rest of nature in ways that threaten the survival of many other species, and eventually could reduce the quality of life for our own species. So some of the things that humans have done, we've reduced biodiversity. We've done this whenever we've cut down trees, especially in the rainforest, to build houses or use for making paper, fuel, and that reduces biodiversity because we're removing all of the species' natural habitats that used to live there. We've increased the use of Earth's net primary productivity. We have increased, unfortunately, genetic resistance of pesticides as well as disease-causing bacteria, so now we're starting to see those superbugs. We've eliminated many of the natural predators because we like hunting for sport, which, isn't typically, that bad of a thing if we're helping to control populations. But there are several periods throughout history where we have drastically decreased the natural order of things because we've killed off top predators, such as the wolves. We almost eradicated the wolf in North America whenever, all of the fairy tales and stuff like that came out, and wolves were bad, so people went out and killed thousands of wolves and removed natural predators from ecosystems. Something that's currently going on is the killing of hundreds of thousands of sharks every single year. I want to say it might even be millions of sharks every year, mostly for shark fin soup. Obviously, some is sporting, so we are taking some of those top predators out. We are deliberately or accidentally introducing potentially harmful species into communities, so invasive species are being introduced. We're using some of our renewable resources at a rate that's higher than that of that they can be replaced. We're interfering with the Earth's chemical cycling and energy flow processes with all of the pollutants that we're putting out into the world. And unfortunately, even though we do have the technology, we're still relying mostly on polluting the Earth with our fossil fuels instead of moving to a more eco-friendly energy type, a more eco-friendly, pollutant-free. Instead of using fossil fuels, we're using green energy. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit later, because there's a lot of debate about fossil fuels versus, using electric cars versus gasoline cars and things like that. Well, I hope that was helpful. If you want to rewatch this video or find more AP Environmental Science videos, you are more than welcome to go to my website, www.nerdlingscience.com. Well, that's all for today. This is the Queen Nerdling signing off. Stay nerdy till next time.